Good evening. Mr. Evans here with Dollar for Luck by Elizabeth Coatsworth, and tonight we are beginning with Chapter 12. Mrs. Philbrook had asked the Trasks up for dinner on the night before they sailed, and the big table in the kitchen was crowded with people, 3 along each side and 1 at each end, with the big lamp in the middle, for the dark came early at the end of September. Half the time Ma and Emily were out of their seats waiting on table, smiling and proud because everyone ate so much of the good things they had been busy getting ready all day. The talk began with the storeboat. "Can't say as we had too bad a season," Cliff admitted. But Belle, for once in a regular dress and a pair of ladies' shoes, laughed one of her sudden hearty laughs. "Cliff don't tell the half of it," she broke in. "In spite of another storeboat on the run, we took in more over the counter than we've ever taken in. It was a lively summer from first to last." Cliff grinned. "Belle's boasting," he said, "but we didn't do too bad, and that's a fact. Ken's getting back the dollar kept things on even keel. He's been a first-rate help, and going to sea doesn't seem to have hurt him none." Mrs. Philbrook smiled. "It's done him good," she said. "I'll have to be getting him new clothes. He's grown out of everything he had." Cliff went on casually. "Next summer, Belle and I thought we could manage some wages. Now Ken's learned the ropes." Belle listened anxiously for the answer, and so did Ken. Once again, Mr. and Mrs. Philbrook's eyes consulted down the table, and then Mr. Philbrook said, "We'll see when the time comes, but the likelihood is that he can go. If he can catch up on his schoolwork, that is." Ken relaxed. "Oh, I'll catch up." "I'll help you," said Emily. "I'm in your grade, and I've got all the books right here for you." "Now you know all about us," said Cliff. "What about you, Otis? How's the yards?" Just as Cliff had answered cautiously, so Mr. Philbrook said with apparent indifference, "Oh, we keep busy." "Busy," repeated Stuart. Dad should have said rushed. "And we've got the prettiest little sloop on the ways now we've ever had. Dad's been changing the design, and this one's a crackerjack. She'll outsail anything we ever built." "And that's to say anything of the size anyone on the coast's building," said Cliff. "Doing her on order?" "No," said Mr. Philbrook. "We're just going to see how she turns out." "Dad means he can afford to ask his own price for her and wait until he gets it," Ralph said. "She's going to be a history maker, all right." "Tomorrow's Saturday," Ken volunteered. "I'll be down to help." "Glad to have you, son," said Mr. Philbrook, but Ralph whistled derisively. "The day you put in 10 hours at the yards will be a day, Ken." "You wait and see." "Of course he will," said Emily. "You don't know a thing about it, Ralph. When I couldn't be ashore, I hated everything that sailed, and now I like to remember the pluribus and all. It's that way with Ken. He had to go to sea. Now he can go. He'll like the yards and being here winters. You wait and see." Ken grinned. "I'd better learn something about building so I can help on my own sloop later on." "When you're 25, Ralph said. For a moment Ken was taken in, but he saw the twinkle in Ralph's eyes and turned to Stuart. "You promised when I was 21, didn't you?" "Sure thing." Stuart, who never was much of a hand at teasing, reassured him. "And if you help, it might be 20, mightn't it, Dad?" Mr. Philbrook gave his quiet smile. "Wouldn't say it mightn't be possible." Belle laughed. "Don't be in too much of a hurry to leave us, Ken." "Oh, I'm not. Only, of course, someday." "Sure," said Cliff. "Belle's only joking. So long as you don't run another storeboat and cut into our trade." "By the way," said Mrs. Philbrook, "the Frasers have turned up again, more out at the elbows than ever." Bad pennies, commented Mr. Philbrook, finishing the last bite of pumpkin pie and wiping his mustache before he pushed back his chair a little from the table and lighted his pipe. Ought we to know the Frasers? Belle asked. Sure, said Ken. They were the ones who robbed the pluribus and went off with the lucky dollar. Of course. Now I remember. Surely the folks around here aren't going to let them stay. Mr. Philbrook took a long puff at his pipe and put in a little more tobacco from his pouch before answering. Well, he said slowly, there's two ways to look at it. One's your way, Mrs. Trask. They certainly aren't desirable. But as Hector Young says, they've got to live somewhere. Can't take them out and drown them, and it don't seem neighborly to force them on other people. So Hector's going to let them use his old fish house, same as he did before, and I expect some of my potatoes and parsnips will disappear same as they did. Of course, Carl Vinyl means to keep an eye on them. Went down and told them so. We figure it's the best we can do, but that's not to say we wouldn't a whole lot rather never set eyes on them again. Mrs. Philbrook was carrying dishes to the sink, but now she stopped with her hands full of plates and turned around. You know, I say half the trouble is they're not wanted anywhere. They've got that look of failure, kind of lost hope. They try this and they try that and never get anywhere. You know how cats are who haven't got a home and have gone wild? If someone would stake those two and they could get ahead, they'd be all right. Ma says that because she saw young Dale took a thorn out of Ella Small's dog's paw once, said Mr. Philbrook. I've seen more than that, declared Mrs. Philbrook stoutly. And what's more, I'm sending them down some clothes by Ken tomorrow. Ouch, cried Ralph. Don't you take any of my things without my knowing, Ma. Last spring you sent off my favorite work pants. High time you used another pair, said his mother, calmly turning back to her work, where, in spite of her protests, Belle as well as Emily joined her, while the men and boys sat at ease around the table talking. Ken had a fine evening. It was like a knot joining his summer with his winter. But when he said goodbye to Cliff and Belle, he didn't feel too badly. The storeboat was going into winter quarters at Swan's Island, and late in May she'd be stopping for Ken on her first cruise down to Boston for supplies. It takes a little warm weather to thaw people out and make them ready to spend, Cliff explained. We used to start soon after the ice was out, but it wasn't worth the trouble. We won't interrupt school too early. Belle kissed both children. I'm so pleased you found a good home, Emily, she said to the little girl, and Emily leaned up and whispered breathlessly in her ear, They've started papers to adopt me. My, ain't that nice? Asked Belle warmly. Who'd have guessed how things was going to turn out? The next morning, Ken was all ready to get to work at the yards, but his mother asked him first to take the things down to the Frasers. Mr. Philbrook and the boys had gone over the bundle grudgingly, trying to rescue favorite old clothes which were being given away, but Mrs. Philbrook held firm. Just start wearing something else steady. It'll soon be comfortable. Land's sakes, you've got plenty of old things left. You won't be bare naked. And, ignoring their pleas, she did up the bundle again and handed it to Ken. No. Can't I take it down to this evening, Ma? No. The sooner they get something decent on their backs, the better. It won't take 10 minutes. You'd better do what your ma says, said Mr. Philbrook. There's no arguing with her when she's got good works in mind. And he gave Mrs. Philbrook a look at once affectionate and rueful. Ken took up the bundle and started down the slope toward the edge of the harbor. Emily waved to him from the window near the sink. He knew she wanted to come, but she had her work to do and didn't suggest it. The E Pluribus Unum was already gone and out of sight beyond the islands, but there were a lot of fishing boats at anchor, and among them 5 or 6 of his father's sloops. Ken recognized every one of them by something in their line, which only his father knew how to put there. He wondered what the new boat would be like. Stuart said she was a crackerjack, and the Philbrooks, as a family, weren't given to praising their own work. It occurred to Ken that maybe with a little practice he could learn how to do scroll work for her bow. He'd found out this summer that he was good at whittling and carving. A crackerjack, like the new sloop was going to be, ought to have a little gold, curling back from her bowsprit, and that was something neither Dad nor the boys was any hand at. Excited by the possibility, Ken loped along the path through the fields, hardly thinking of his errand at all. He found the Frasers digging clams and looking thinner and raggeder than ever. At his hail, they waded back to shore, eyeing him suspiciously all the time, and he suddenly wondered if they knew that it was he who had found the twisted dollar from the pluribus in the mud where they had been digging, and thus had brought suspicion upon them. He handed Big Dale the bundle a little awkwardly. "Hello, Mr. Fraser," he said. "Ma thought maybe you could use these." "Thanks," said the clam digger. "Guess so. You back again?" The words were simple enough, but they set Ken's heart racing, and he turned his face away quickly so that the man shouldn't see his eyes. "Yes," he mumbled. "Hello, Dale. Guess I've got to be going." And he hurried off without another word to either of them, leaving them staring after him. For now he realized why the voices of the sheep killers, which he had heard in the night at Star Island, had sounded familiar. He was as sure as he was that the sun was shining, that father and son, the Frasers, had been on the island that night. Twice now he had come upon the evidences of their lawlessness. With a shiver, Ken wondered if there were to be a third time. Chapter 13. Monday morning, Miss Benson looked at Ken over the tops of her glasses, and a smile appeared among the long wrinkles of her face. "Glad to see you're back, Kenneth," she said. "Home as the sailor home from the sea. Had a good time?" "Most good times have to be paid for, and you'll have to pay for this with makeup work. But we'll get it over quickly, hard and fast, as they say." Ken had studied under Miss Benson since he was in the 4th grade, and he liked her. It seemed nice to be back in the schoolhouse he knew so well, with all the other boys and girls whom he had grown up with. For several days he was quite a hero, and everyone wanted to hear about life on the storeboat and his adventure on Star Island. They knew Star already. She was always tagging around after Emily when she got a chance. One thing Ken told nobody, not even his father or mother, not even Emily, and that was about the voices he had heard that night, about their being the Frasers' voices. He didn't quite know himself why he didn't tell. Perhaps he didn't want to hear his father ask, "Are you sure, Ken? You could easily be mistaken in the dark like that." Maybe you could say easy be mistaken, but inside himself he was sure. After the first 2 weeks, when it was study all the time, he got a chance to get down to the shop. The first Saturday that he went down with his father and the boys after early breakfast, Ralph asked him, "Inspection trip?" "Maybe," said Ken, not getting mad. He knew well enough how to make himself useful in the tool shed, and now for the first time he enjoyed it. The smell of clean wood, the sound of hammers, the occasional speech of the men, all heard and seen in the shadows against the bright ripples of the harbor, and the scream of the gulls where the buildings stood open, made his work of cleaning up shavings and bringing tools and such things pleasant. Stuart stopped on the floor beside him to look up at the sloop's hull, which was still half frame. "Can you see what a little beauty she's going to be?" And suddenly Ken saw how she was different from all the other sloops his father had built. Somewhere, watching the gulls brooding over fish, shading his eyes to study a porpoise in action, Dad had gotten a new idea, something maybe no one else in all the world had ever had. And standing there beside Stuart, looking up at the first beginnings of the vessel, Ken shared something of his older brother's pride and excitement. Late in the afternoon, Ken found time to go off by himself a little with a piece of smooth board and some chalk he'd found. Looking at the hull, he began drawing a pattern, like a branch with leaves on it for the scroll. But it wasn't what he wanted. The leaves kept sticking stiffly up from the stem, however he drew them, and there were too many of them. He was absorbed in the problem, frowning and biting his lip, erasing with his elbow nearly as fast as he drew. He jumped when he heard his father's voice behind him. "I've seen worse. But maybe you'd better go down and look at Cy Smith's schooner. She's got some pretty trim. And when you've looked at her and Ben Haskell's, pick a couple of young apple shoots and study them. Hold them butt end to the wind so the leaves ripple back. You always have to think of wind when you think of a vessel." Ken went down to the harbor, and when he'd seen Cy Smith's Adventurer, he thought he knew what was wrong with his own drawing, and came hurrying back to draw again. He didn't like to have Ralph think he wasn't putting in a full day's work. But still, the leaves didn't look just right, and again he heard his father's voice. "You been to the orchard?" "No, Dad. I thought after seeing The Adventurer I had the idea." "Don't be in such a tarnation hurry. When you're making anything, look at what other folks have made, but then go back and see what God's made. And after that, take time to ponder. There, Stuart needs help with that sheathing. Leave this till next week and let it come clear in your mind." "That's the way you do, Dad?" Mr. Philbrick smiled. "The idea for this sloop's been kind of simmering on the back of the stove for 2 years. Gosh." Ken climbed the scaffolding with a new understanding of his father. He began to feel the excitement of shipbuilding, an excitement tempered by great patience. He even got so far as to ask Stuart if he really liked the work. "Wouldn't change for any other job I ever heard of." "Not even to be a captain?" "Captain? Most anyone can be a captain, but it takes brains to build real good boats." Ken was unshaken. "I'd rather be a captain." "No harm in that," said Stuart tolerantly, going on with his hammering. It was a month before Ken had the scroll drawn to suit him, and then in his spare time he worked at it, learning the hard way, by himself, how to carve the pattern into the wood. Sometimes Emily and Star came down to watch him for a little, but Mr. Philbrick didn't encourage girls or lambs about the shop, and soon shooed them off. But on other days, Ken and Emily were a good deal together. She was always ready to go with him, fishing or picking chestnuts or gathering apples from the trees back of the house, and often lent him a hand with the stove wood. And she relied on him in return. When Jim Bancroft, always a bully, teased her about her eyes being different colors, and threatened to tie her braids to a nail on the schoolhouse door, she told him, "You better not let Ken Philbrick catch you doing it." And Ken, hearing his name, came right up and put an end to Jim's teasing. Emily was the only one in the family, except his father, who knew all the ports that Ken had been to, and his father hadn't visited them for years, and of course had never laid eyes on the children. But Emily knew the children too, and had her own opinion of each, and she knew just how the harbors looked and what color the houses were painted. The two would sit by the hour, discussing the coast of Maine. And while life went on, busily and quietly, the red and yellow leaves drifted from the trees, and the frost came, and the ground hardened underfoot, and the children were glad to wear coats and mittens to school. And then came the snow. Uncertainly at first, staying only a few hours, and then a few days, and at last settling in and making itself at home for the winter. Ken and Emily were too old to build snowmen, but they made a fort and held it against all comers. And Ken got out his old sled, and they went sliding with the other children, screaming with excitement, as they tore down the slope from the village, shot into the air over the bank at the shore, landed on the harbor ice with a satisfying bang, only to fly on almost out to the islands. Work at the shop slowed down. though they kept the big barrel wood stove going and closed up the open front of the building. But even so, a man's hands were half numbed and everything took longer. By now the sloop was taking shape and finish. She would be ready for launching as soon as the ice was out. Ken's carving was finished, and Emily was helping him lay on the gold leaf, working at the kitchen table. It was on a Saturday morning in early March when Mr. Philbrook looked up from his big plate of ham and eggs one morning to say, "I'm driving up to Waldoboro for a keg of nails. You two young ones want to come along?" "I wish you'd asked me," Ralph spoke up. "Mill Davis and I said I could use his smelt shandy any time I liked, and Mom could use some smelt, couldn't you, Mom?" "Indeed I could," said Mrs. Philbrook. "This time of year they taste good. But isn't it late? After this warm spell ice must be almost ready to go out." "No, everyone's still fishing. Ice is getting a little rotten, but nothing too bad, the boys say." "Couldn't Emily and I stop off and fish while you were in town, Dad?" Ken asked. Mrs. Philbrook looked up, ready to object, but then she stopped. She let her husband decide for the boys what was safe or not safe. Her world was in the house, and there she gave the orders. Mr. Philbrook considered. "Well, bring your lines and bait anyhow, and we'll see when we get there. Perhaps you'd better run over and make sure Mill won't be using his house today." The snow was thinning along the roads, but there was still enough for the livery sleigh, and the bells rang out gaily along the fills as they started out. It was a fine day with a blue sky, and the white clouds had a springtime look, and the blue jays seemed very much in evidence. "About time to be sugaring up country," Mr. Philbrook remarked. "Won't be much more winter now." Their road took them along the broad Melomac River, and pretty soon they began seeing small groups of smelt shanties on the ice, with smoke coming from most of their stovepipes. They were made of canvas nailed on light frames and painted, some red, some brown, some green, and some blue, according to their owners' fancies or the paint they happened to have in the shed. Set down as they were in a line, they looked like little village streets. "See, Dad," Ken exclaimed. "Everyone's fishing." Mr. Philbrook nodded, but said nothing. When they could see the church steeples of Waldoboro, they came to a bend of the road, and another village of 6 or 7 shanties well out on the ice. "That's Mill's over there, the red one," urged Ken. "We'll be careful," Emily chimed in. Mr. Philbrook drew rein, and for a long minute looked off over the river. The shanties were well out from shore above the current where the fish were running. There was smoke coming from 3 stovepipes. "I guess it's all right," he said at last, not quite at ease. "I'll only be gone an hour or so. If you children hear the ice get to cracking, come right ashore as fast as you can, and don't wait for anything. But folks seem to think the ice will hold a while longer." Emily and Ken climbed out, Ken with a basket of wood, split small and fine, and Emily with the bucket holding the lines and bait and a package of sandwiches. Cheerfully waving their red mittens, they watched Mr. Philbrook drive off. "I'll walk out and get you," he promised. "Inside you couldn't hear me holler from the road." In high spirits, the children ran down the steep path to the shore. There was a path across the ice, too, easy to follow, but a little soft underfoot. "It must be all right, or people wouldn't be fishing," Emily said. Ken agreed. "There's Dale Fraser over there. Wonder who lent them a shanty." "Probably stole it," said Emily cheerfully. "Dad says they haven't enough spunk in them to do anything that could be pinned on them. He said they're cowards, like stray dogs." "I always feel awfully sorry for stray dogs," said Emily with sudden seriousness. They waved to young Dale, who gave them an almost invisible nod as he went back into the smelt house. He was surly with everyone, worse even than old Dale. When they glanced into the next house where a stove was going, they found nobody there, though they could see clearly the marks of a pail and a pair of orange boots in the ice. Even the fire was almost out. And the other shanty, which had seemed occupied, was empty too. Ken looked at Emily a little doubtfully. "What do you think?" "Well, there's no house to go to. We'd freeze waiting around. We've got to light the stove and get in where it's warm." Ken nodded slowly. "The Frasers are out," he said, "still." "Want to walk to Waldoboro?" Emily asked. "We'll be all right. It's only for an hour or two." "Wish the shanty was nearer to shore. It's out beyond any of the others." "Could we move it?" "Sure, but if we went in over the flats, there'd be no fishing." "Let's not worry then. Your dad wouldn't have said we could if there'd been any danger. Do light the fire, Ken. The wind's chilly in spite of the sun." The inside of the smelt shanty was tiny, with room for a very small stove, an old kitchen chair with a broken back, and a hole in the ice which seemed to lead down into a bottomless black pit. Ken lighted the fire and baited the hooks for both their lines, and each sat on half the chair. The little room filled with a cheerful warmth, and soon they opened their coats. The outside world was all shut off from them by the canvas walls of their shelter. They kept very still now, for if they talked, the smelt would not come near. "I must listen for the ice," Ken thought. "I mustn't get too interested in fishing." But that was before the smelt began to bite. And that is the end of our reading for this evening. Tomorrow night we will start with chapter 14, and it looks like we may be finishing the book. I will see you tomorrow night. Have a good evening.